October 15, 1944, Camp Hearne, Texas. The late afternoon sun hung low over the flat Texas landscape, turning the dust-covered compound into shades of amber and gold. Inside the mess hall of the women's section, a moment was unfolding that would become legendary among the guards and prisoners alike. Lieutenant Colonel William Harrison, camp commander, sat across a wooden table from 4 Italian women prisoners, trying to understand exactly what they were asking him. His weathered face, marked by 30 years of military service, showed a mixture of confusion and disbelief. The woman doing most of the speaking was 26-year-old Giulia Rossi, a former communications officer from Naples, who had been captured in Tunisia 18 months earlier. Her dark eyes held a determination that seemed at odds with her prisoner status. She spoke in careful, accented English, her hands gesturing in that distinctly Italian way that made even simple requests seem like passionate pleas. "Colonel, we understand this is unusual," she said, measuring each word. "But we ask permission to cook real Italian food for everyone, not just for us, for your soldiers too." The other 3 women sat rigid with nervous anticipation. Maria Benedetti, a 31-year-old nurse from Rome; Francesca Leone, barely 22, who had served as a clerk in the Italian army; and Sofia Marino, 28, a radio operator from Sicily. Each had spent over a year in American captivity, moving between camps, always under guard, always reminded that they were the enemy. Lieutenant Jackson, the young officer standing behind the colonel, couldn't hide his surprise. "Ma'am," with respect, he began, but the colonel raised his hand for silence. Harrison leaned forward, his Texas drawl soft but skeptical. "Miss Rossi, help me understand. You want us to give you access to the kitchen, you want us to provide you with ingredients, and you want to cook for American soldiers. The ones who are guarding you, the ones whose country is at war with yours." Giulia nodded slowly. "Yes, Colonel, exactly this." The silence that followed felt heavy with the weight of everything unsaid. Outside, the sounds of the camp continued, guards walking their posts. The distant sound of men's voices from the larger compound, where thousands of Italian and German male prisoners were housed, the wind moving through the mesquite trees that dotted the Texas landscape. Harrison studied the 4 women before him. They didn't look like dangerous enemies. They looked tired, homesick, and desperately hopeful. But this request was unprecedented. Prisoners of war didn't cook for their captors. They didn't ask for special privileges. They certainly didn't offer acts of service that seemed almost like friendship. What could possibly make these women risk such a bold request? And more importantly, what would it mean if he said yes? July 12, 1944. 3 months before that unprecedented meeting with Colonel Harrison, the Italian women had arrived at Camp Hearne, under circumstances none of them could have imagined when they first joined Italy's military auxiliary services. The train that brought them from the East Coast had traveled for 5 days, moving steadily westward through landscapes that became increasingly alien to eyes accustomed to Mediterranean coastlines and ancient European cities. Giulia Rossi pressed her face against the train window during that journey, watching America unfold before her. The endless flatness of Texas seemed impossible after the hills of Naples. Where were the stone buildings that had stood for centuries? Where were the narrow streets and the olive groves? Everything here seemed new, temporary, and impossibly vast. She had been captured in March of 1943 during the final days of the North African campaign. Along with 200 other Italian women serving in various support roles, she had been processed as a prisoner of war, a designation that still felt surreal. Women weren't supposed to be combat prisoners. Women weren't supposed to be shipped across an ocean to enemy territory. Yet here she was, along with 36 other Italian women, being transported to a prisoner of war camp in Texas. When they finally arrived at Camp Hearne, stepping off the transport truck into the blazing July heat, the women were met with stares from guards who seemed just as surprised to see them as they were to be there. Private Tommy Martinez, a 23-year-old ranch hand from El Paso who had been drafted the previous year, later told his friends that Seeing those Italian women arrive was like watching something from a Hollywood movie, except none of it made sense. They looked so out of place, he remembered. Like if you put penguins in the desert. They were wearing modified military uniforms, their dark hair pulled back despite the heat, their faces showing exhaustion and uncertainty. Most were in their 20s and early 30s, educated women who had believed they were serving their country in administrative, medical, or communications roles. Now they found themselves prisoners in a land where nothing felt familiar. The women's compound was separated from the main camp where thousands of Italian and German male prisoners were housed. It consisted of 4 wooden barracks, a small administration building, a mess hall, and a recreation area surrounded by chain-link fencing and guard towers. The structures were basic but clean, built hastily as the camp expanded to accommodate the unexpected influx of female prisoners. Sergeant Ruth Palmer, one of only 3 female guards assigned to the facility, conducted the initial orientation. She spoke slowly, assuming the women understood little English. You will follow all camp regulations. You will report for roll call twice daily. You will work in assigned duties. Any violations will be punished. The Italian women listened in silence, their faces carefully neutral. They had learned during their months of captivity that showing emotion was a form of vulnerability they couldn't afford. Better to appear calm, dignified, resigned to their fate. But inside, each woman carried the same desperate questions. How long would they be here? What was happening to their families back in Italy? Would they ever see home again? The first weeks at Camp Hearne established a pattern of careful distance between the Italian women and their American captors. The prisoners moved through their days like ghosts, present but not truly there, following orders without complaint, but offering nothing beyond what was required. They worked in the camp laundry, cleaned administrative buildings, and tended to the small vegetable garden that had been planted near their compound. But they did so in silence, speaking only to each other in rapid Italian that the guards couldn't understand. Giulia found the silence suffocating. Back in Naples, life had been loud, chaotic, filled with voices calling from windows and music spilling from doorways. Even during the war, even during the bombing raids and the shortages, there had been a kind of vibrant noise to existence. Here in Texas, the only sounds were the wind moving across the empty plains and the occasional bark of orders from guards who seemed almost as uncomfortable with this arrangement as the prisoners themselves. The cultural divide between the Italian women and their Texan guards manifested in countless small ways. When Sergeant Palmer tried to organize recreational activities, suggesting that the women might enjoy playing baseball, they stared at her with polite incomprehension. Baseball meant nothing to them. When Private Martinez attempted conversation with simple English phrases, they responded with minimal words, never volunteering information, never extending the interaction beyond what was absolutely necessary. The other guards, mostly young men from Texas ranching families, didn't know what to make of these foreign women. Corporal James Reed from Amarillo admitted to his fellow guards that he found the whole situation awkward. "I know how to handle cattle and horses," he said. "I even know how to guard German soldiers. But Italian ladies who don't talk? That's above my pay grade." The women maintained their own internal hierarchy and support system. Maria Benedetti, the oldest at 31, became an unofficial leader, offering quiet counsel when the younger women struggled with homesickness. Francesca Leone, the youngest, tried to maintain optimism, but her forced smiles couldn't hide the tears she shed most nights in her bunk. Sophia Marino wrote letters constantly, filling page after page with words meant for her family in Sicily, though she had no way of knowing if the letters would ever reach them or if anyone she loved was still alive to read them. The mess hall became a daily reminder of everything they had lost. American food was alien to their palates. The bread was too soft, too sweet. The meat was overcooked and underseasoned. Coffee was served weak and watery, nothing like the strong espresso they had grown up with. They ate mechanically, consuming calories without pleasure, treating meals as fuel rather than the social and cultural experience food had always been in their Mediterranean homeland. At night, lying in their bunks in the suffocating Texas heat, The women whispered to each other in Italian. They spoke of mothers and sisters, of neighborhoods they might never see again, of the lives they had imagined having before the war consumed everything. They were prisoners, yes, but more than that, they were exiles. Cut off not just from freedom, but from everything that had made them feel like themselves. Private Tommy Martinez had grown up in El Paso, where the border between Mexico and Texas was more than just a line on a map. It was a place where languages mixed, where families had roots on both sides, and where being caught between two worlds was simply the way life worked. His grandmother, Abuela Rosa, had crossed into Texas from Chihuahua in 1912, carrying nothing but a small bag of belongings and recipes she kept memorized in her head. Tommy had spent his childhood in her kitchen, watching her transform simple ingredients into meals that somehow tasted like love and memory combined. When he looked at the Italian women prisoners, he didn't see enemies. He saw his grandmother's face in their homesick expressions. He recognized the particular loneliness that comes from being displaced, from living in a place where nothing smells or tastes or sounds like home. It was a small moment that changed everything. Mid-August, during the suffocating heat of a Texas afternoon, Tommy was on guard duty near the women's compound when he noticed Giulia sitting alone in the shade of one of the barracks. She held a photograph in her hands, staring at it with such intensity that she didn't hear him approach. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said softly in his accented English. "You okay?" Giulia looked up, startled, and quickly tried to hide the photograph, but Tommy had already seen it. A family portrait, a woman who must have been her mother, two young children who might have been siblings. "I'm sorry," he said. "I didn't mean to intrude. It's just, you look like my abuela does when she thinks about the family she left behind in Mexico." Giulia studied him with surprise. "Your abuela? Your grandmother? She is from Mexico?" Tommy nodded. "Came across when she was about your age, I reckon. Used to tell me that the hardest part wasn't the poverty or the hard work. It was not being able to cook the food that reminded her of home." Something in Giulia's carefully maintained composure cracked slightly. She spoke quietly, as if confessing something shameful. "I dream about food. Not just eating it, making it. The smell of garlic and tomatoes, the feeling of kneading dough. I wake up and for a moment I think I am in my mother's kitchen. Then I remember where I am." Tommy surprised himself with what he said next. "What would you cook? If you could cook anything right now?" Giulia's eyes lit up with an intensity that transformed her face. "Pasta," she said immediately. "Real pasta. Not from a box. Made by hand, the way my grandmother taught me. With a simple sauce of tomatoes, basil, olive oil. Nothing fancy. Just," she searched for the English word, "honest food." Over the following weeks, Tommy found reasons to be assigned to guard duty near the women's compound. He began bringing small things. A sprig of basil he had found growing wild near the camp perimeter. A tomato from the camp garden that was actually ripe instead of picked green. The women began to trust him, to understand that not all American soldiers saw them simply as enemies to be contained. September brought slightly cooler temperatures to central Texas, though cooler was a relative term. The mornings still arrived hot, and by afternoon the compound shimmered with heat waves rising from the dusty ground. It was during one of these September mornings that Giulia Rossi had a breakdown that would change the trajectory of life at Camp Hearne. The women had been assigned to work in the camp's vegetable garden, a plot of land behind the mess hall where American staff grew supplemental food for the facility. Sergeant Palmer led them there, handing out gloves and small shovels, explaining that they would be weeding and harvesting whatever was ready. The garden was modest but well maintained, with rows of beans, squash, peppers, and several dozen tomato plants that had survived the brutal Texas summer. Giulia was assigned to the tomato section. She knelt in the dirt, reaching for the first cluster of fruit when something inside her simply broke. The tomatoes were small, different from the varieties she knew from Naples, but the smell was unmistakable. That sharp, green scent of tomato leaves mixed with the sweet aroma of ripening fruit. It was the smell of her mother's garden, of summer afternoons helping prepare sauce for the winter, of everything she had lost, She didn't realize she was crying until the tears began falling onto the tomato leaves, making dark spots in the dust. Then, the crying became sobbing, deep, wrenching sounds that she couldn't control or suppress. Her hands clutched a tomato with such desperate tenderness that it began to bruise under her fingers. Maria Benedetti was the first to reach her, kneeling beside her with worry etched across her face. "Giulia, Cara, what is wrong? Are you hurt?" But Giulia couldn't answer. She could only hold that tomato and weep for everything it represented. Home, family. The life she had before the war turned her into a prisoner in a foreign land. The normalcy of walking into a kitchen and cooking food that connected her to generations of women in her family who had done the same thing. Francesca and Sofia quickly joined them, forming a protective circle around Giulia. The other prisoners working nearby stopped their tasks, understanding immediately what was happening. This wasn't just about tomatoes. This was about the accumulated grief of months of displacement, of not knowing if their families were alive, of eating foreign food and sleeping in foreign beds and living half a life in a place that would never feel like home. Tommy Martinez, on guard duty that morning, watched from his post near the fence. He saw Sergeant Palmer approach the group of Italian women, saw her face shift from concern to understanding. He saw how the women comforted Giulia with gentle hands and soft Italian words, how they surrounded her with the solidarity of shared suffering. Later, after Giulia had composed herself and the women had returned to work in subdued silence, Tommy approached Sergeant Palmer. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "I think I might understand what just happened." Palmer looked at him with tired eyes. "Enlighten me, Private." "She misses cooking. Not just eating. Cooking. Making food the way her family made it." Tommy gestured toward the tomato plants. Those tomatoes, they probably reminded her of home so hard it hurt. Chapter 6. The Pasta Proposal. 3 days after Giulia's breakdown in the garden, something shifted in the women's compound. What had begun as one woman's moment of grief transformed into collective determination. The Italian women started talking among themselves with new urgency, their voices rising and falling in passionate debate during evening hours. They were planning something, and the guards noticed the change in energy. Maria Benedetti, always the practical one, argued for caution. "We are prisoners," she reminded the others in Italian. "We cannot simply demand privileges. We must be strategic, respectful." But Giulia, emboldened by something she couldn't quite name, felt differently. What is the worst they can say? No. We are already prisoners. We have already lost everything. At least let us try to reclaim one small piece of who we are. Francesca worried about the risk. What if they think we are trying to cause trouble? What if it makes our situation worse? Sofia, the quiet radio operator from Sicily, surprised everyone by speaking up forcefully. "I did not survive bombs and capture and an ocean crossing just to spend the rest of this war eating tasteless food and pretending I am not Italian. If Giulia wants to ask, I will stand with her." The plan came together over several days. They would approach Colonel Harrison formally as a delegation. They would present their request not as a demand, but as an offer, an exchange. They would cook not just for themselves, but for everyone. It was this last part that Giulia insisted upon. If we only cook for ourselves, we remain separate. But if we cook for them, for the Americans, then we are not asking for special treatment. We are offering something. We are building a bridge. Tommy Martinez, when he learned of their plan, tried to prepare them for disappointment. "The colonel, he's a fair man, but this is unusual. Real unusual. I just don't want you ladies to get your hopes too high." But Giulia smiled, the first genuine smile anyone had seen from her in weeks. "Private Martinez, sometimes the only way to survive is to do something unusual." On October 15th, the 4 women requested a formal meeting with the camp commander. Colonel Harrison, curious about what could possibly require such formality, agreed to see them that afternoon. They prepared as if going to battle. Maria checked everyone's appearance, making sure their uniforms were as neat as possible. Francesca practiced English phrases under her breath. Sophia stood straight, drawing on her military training to project confidence. And Giulia rehearsed what she would say, knowing that everything depended on finding the right words. When they entered the mess hall where Colonel Harrison waited, Giulia felt her heart pounding so hard she was certain everyone could hear it. This was it. The moment where they would either be dismissed as foolish prisoners with unreasonable requests, or where they might reclaim some small piece of their dignity and identity. Colonel Harrison sat across from them, his weathered face neutral but his eyes sharp with curiosity. Lieutenant Jackson stood behind him, young and clearly skeptical of whatever these Italian women wanted. The late afternoon sun slanted through the windows, casting long shadows across the wooden table between them. Giulia took a breath, met the colonel's eyes, and began to speak. Colonel Harrison had done many unexpected things during his 30 years of military service, but agreeing to let enemy prisoners cook for American soldiers ranked among the strangest. Yet something in Giulia Rossi's passionate plea had moved him. Perhaps it was the sheer audacity of the request. Perhaps it was the recognition that these women were suffering in ways that had nothing to do with physical hardship. Or perhaps, as he later admitted to Lieutenant Jackson, it was simply because it seemed like the human thing to do. There were conditions, of course. The women would cook under supervision. They would submit their menu in advance. They would use only ingredients provided by the camp commissary. And this would be a one-time trial. If anything went wrong, the privilege would be immediately revoked. Giulia accepted every condition with barely contained joy. When she returned to the women's compound that evening and announced that their request had been approved, the reaction was electric. Women who had maintained stoic composure for months suddenly embraced each other with tears streaming down their faces. They were going to cook. They were going to make real Italian food. They were going to, for one evening at least, feel like themselves again. The preparation took 3 days. The women submitted a menu for pasta al pomodoro, the simplest and most honest Italian dish they could imagine. Fresh pasta with tomato sauce, garlic, basil, and olive oil. Nothing fancy. Nothing that would require exotic ingredients. Just pure, straightforward food, made the way their grandmothers had taught them. The camp commissary provided flour, eggs, canned tomatoes from the garden harvest, garlic, and a precious bottle of olive oil that had been sourced from somewhere. The women treated these ingredients like treasures. On the morning of October 22nd, Giulia, Maria, Francesca, and Sophia entered the camp kitchen under the watchful eye of Sergeant Palmer and 2 guards. The camp cook, a gruff man named Bill Henderson from Corpus Christi, watched these Italian women with open skepticism. He had been cooking army food for 15 years and didn't appreciate foreigners, implying his meals weren't good enough. But his skepticism began to fade the moment the women started working. They moved with practiced efficiency, their hands knowing instinctively what to do. Giulia and Maria made the pasta dough, kneading it with rhythmic precision, their movements almost meditative. Francesca prepared the tomato sauce, her face transformed with concentration as she crushed garlic and tore fresh basil. Sophia rolled out pasta sheets with a borrowed rolling pin, creating long ribbons of fettuccine with remarkable uniformity. The kitchen filled with aromas that seemed impossible in this utilitarian military space. Garlic sizzling in olive oil, tomatoes reducing into sauce, fresh pasta dough resting under clean towels. Even Bill Henderson stopped scowling and started watching with reluctant interest. Tommy Martinez, assigned as one of the guards, found himself mesmerized. This wasn't just cooking, this was art, ritual, memory, made tangible. The women worked with such care, such love for what they were creating. By evening, when the first plates of pasta were served in the mess hall, something remarkable happened. Cowboys who had never tasted real Italian food found themselves surprised by flavors that were both simple and complex. The success of the pasta dinner created an unexpected warmth in the camp. For several weeks afterward, the atmosphere shifted. Guards smiled more. The Italian women walked with straighter backs, their dignity restored through that one act of cultural sharing. Colonel Harrison approved additional cooking sessions, and the women began teaching some of the American staff how to make simple Italian dishes. It felt, for a brief moment, like something approaching normalcy. Then the letters arrived. November 3, 1944. The mail call that would shatter whatever fragile peace had been established. The International Red Cross had finally managed to route correspondence through the chaos of war-torn Italy, and a packet of letters arrived for the women's compound. Sergeant Palmer distributed them during evening formation, calling out names with careful pronunciation. Some women received letters, many did not. Giulia stood holding an envelope addressed in her mother's handwriting, her hands shaking so violently she could barely open it. Around her, other women tore into their own correspondence with desperate hope. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of weeping. Maria Benedetti sank to her knees, her letter falling from her hands, her entire family gone. Her parents, her 2 brothers, her sister, all killed when Allied bombs struck their neighborhood in Rome during a raid in July. The letter was from a neighbor, someone who had survived and felt obligated to tell Maria the truth. Sophia's letter brought different, but equally devastating news. Her village in Sicily had been destroyed during the invasion. Her family had fled, but no one knew where. She might have relatives alive somewhere, but they were scattered, lost in the chaos of refugees flooding across Italy. Francesca received no letter at all, which somehow felt worse than bad news. The not knowing. The terrible possibility that everyone she loved was simply gone, and no one cared enough to even inform her. Giulia's letter was the most complicated. Her mother was alive, living in the ruins of their Naples neighborhood, but her younger brother, Luca, had been conscripted into the Italian Social Republic, Mussolini's puppet regime in northern Italy. He was fighting for the wrong side of a civil war, branded a fascist by those who opposed the German occupation. Her mother wrote in careful language, knowing the letter would be censored, but the message was clear. Coming home meant walking into a nightmare of political vengeance, starvation, and a country tearing itself apart. That night, the women's barracks filled with a grief that had been delayed but never diminished. They had known, intellectually, that Italy was suffering. They had read newspapers, heard reports, but knowing abstractly was different from knowing personally, from holding proof in their hands that the world they had left no longer existed. Tommy Martinez, making his rounds that night, heard the sounds of mourning through the barracks walls. He had never felt more inadequate in his life. What could he possibly say to women who had just learned they had nothing to return to? The next morning the women moved through their routines like automatons. The joy that had animated them during the cooking sessions was gone, replaced by hollow-eyed exhaustion. December 1944 brought an unexpected development. Colonel Harrison, moved by the women's devastating news from home, made a decision that went against typical military protocol. He authorized increased interaction between the Italian prisoners and American staff, reasoning that isolation would only deepen their despair. What followed was a gradual dissolution of the barriers that had separated captors from captives. The women were invited to join holiday preparations. They helped decorate the mess hall with paper chains and handmade ornaments. They taught American soldiers Italian Christmas carols, while learning English ones in return. And they continued cooking, now regularly preparing meals that had become surprisingly popular among the Texas cowboys who had never imagined they would enjoy foreign food. Tommy Martinez found himself spending more and more time talking with Giulia. Their conversation started with simple exchanges about food and family, but deepened into discussions about identity, belonging, and what home truly meant. Tommy spoke about growing up between 2 cultures. Never quite Mexican enough for his grandmother's generation, never quite American enough for his schoolmates. Giulia understood that feeling more deeply now than she ever had before. "I thought I knew who I was," she told him one evening as they sat on opposite sides of the compound fence. "I was Italian. I was from Naples. I served my country. But now? My country did terrible things I never knew about. My city is destroyed. My brother fights for fascists. Who am I now?" Tommy had no easy answers, but he offered something perhaps more valuable than answers: acceptance. "You're Giulia," he said simply. "You're a person who makes incredible pasta and cares about people and is trying to figure out what comes next. That's enough." Similar bonds formed throughout the camp. Bill Henderson, the skeptical cook, had become something like a protective uncle to the Italian women, teaching them Texas recipes while learning Italian techniques. Sergeant Palmer developed a particularly close friendship with Maria Benedetti, two women in their 30s who had both lost family to the war and found unexpected solace in each other's company. Even the younger guards, who had initially been awkward and uncertain around the Italian women, now treated them with easy familiarity. Corporal Reed from Amarillo, who had once complained about not knowing how to guard Italian ladies, now brought his harmonica to evening gatherings where the women sang. The music mixed Italian folk songs with American country tunes in combinations that should have been impossible but somehow worked. As winter settled over Texas, bringing cooler temperatures and occasional rain, the question of repatriation loomed larger. The war in Europe was clearly ending. Germany was retreating on all fronts. Italy's civil war was reaching its brutal conclusion. Soon, the Italian women would be sent back to whatever remained of their homeland. The prospect filled many of them with dread rather than hope. Sophia spoke for many when she confessed to the group one evening, "I am afraid to go back. Not just afraid of the destruction, afraid of who I will have to become to survive there. Here, I can still be myself." May 8, 1970. 25 years after the end of World War II in Europe, a restaurant in Austin, Texas called Giulia's had become locally famous for serving the most authentic Italian food in the state. The woman who owned it, Giulia Martinez, stood in her kitchen, preparing pasta the way her mother had taught her in Naples, the way she had first made it for confused Texas cowboys in a prisoner of war camp. She was 51 years old now, her dark hair streaked with gray, her accented English softened but never lost. Beside her worked her daughter Rosa, named for Tommy's grandmother, rolling out fresh fettuccine with the same practiced motions her mother had perfected decades earlier. The restaurant was more than just a business. It had become a gathering place for an unlikely community. Tonight was special, a reunion. Around the large family-style table in the private dining room sat people whose lives had been forever changed by what happened at Camp Hearne. Tommy Martinez, now a high school teacher, sat beside his wife Giulia, their 3 children grown and scattered across Texas. Maria Benedetti Palmer, who had married Sergeant Ruth Palmer in a small ceremony in 1967 after Texas laws finally allowed it, traveled from San Antonio, where she worked as a hospital administrator. Bill Henderson, retired from the Army and now running a small diner that served both Texas barbecue and Italian specialties, had driven up from Corpus Christi. Even Colonel Harrison, now 83 years old, had made the journey, his memories of that unprecedented decision still clear despite the passage of years. Of the original 37 Italian women who had been prisoners at Camp Hearne, 14 had chosen to remain in America after the war. The process had been complicated, requiring special dispensations and immigration sponsorships, but the bonds formed during those months of captivity had proven stronger than bureaucratic obstacles. The women who had returned to Italy carried with them stories of American kindness that helped shape post-war reconciliation efforts. Several had become leaders in Italian-American friendship organizations, working to strengthen bonds between former enemies. Sophia Marino, who had returned to Sicily, wrote regularly to Giulia, her letters describing how she had helped rebuild her village and now ran a community center, teaching young people about the cost of hatred and the possibility of forgiveness. As Giulia served the pasta that evening, the same simple pomodoro sauce that had started everything, she thought about the journey that had brought them all here, from enemies to friends, from prisoners to citizens, from despair to hope. She raised her glass of wine, and the table fell quiet. 25 years ago, she said, her voice carrying the emotion of decades, we were prisoners who asked for permission to cook. We thought we were just asking for pasta. But what we were really asking for was the chance to be human again, to be seen as people, not just enemies. Colonel Harrison raised his own glass, his hand steady despite his years. "And what you taught us, Miss Giulia, is that humanity doesn't take sides in war. It just waits for someone brave enough to reach across the divide." The pasta that night tasted exactly as it had in that prison camp kitchen 25 years earlier. Simple, honest, made with love. But its legacy had proven far more complex. The story of Italian women prisoners who cooked for their captors had influenced American policies toward former enemies, demonstrating that compassion and dignity could achieve what force never could. It had shown that redemption was possible when people chose to see past their differences, to recognize their shared humanity. As the evening ended and friends embraced before parting, Giulia stood in her kitchen and looked at the photographs covering one wall, images from the camp. Pictures of women in prison uniforms standing beside cowboys in guard towers. A snapshot of that first pasta dinner, faces lit with surprise and joy. And more recent photos. Weddings, children, graduations, lives built on the foundation of an impossible choice made in wartime. The legacy of that meal was not just about food, it was about the courage to ask for connection when separation seemed safer, the wisdom to offer kindness when hatred seemed justified, and the faith that even enemies could become family if given the chance. In the end, what happened at Camp Hearne proved something essential about the American promise, that it was never really about where you came from, but about who you chose to become. And that sometimes the most revolutionary act of all was simply making pasta for someone you were supposed to hate, and discovering that hatred was never as strong as the human need to break bread together.